Hello everyone, welcome to e-GMAT. This is Harsha, one of the verbal experts here, and in this video we're going to solve a super exciting and super illustrative strengthened question. So as always, pause the video, solve the question, and then let's resume. Alright, so this is a 700 level question. It's from GMAT Advanced, and of course it is a strengthened question. So this question is extremely illustrative in terms of learnings. You're gonna see that in this video. The first aspect that's of interest to me is the fact that this is a question where there's a lot of information given in the argument, and not all of it is relevant as far as your actual logic is concerned. Or in other words, there's a lot of background information that's given to you. It is our job to extract the relevant logic, and by that I mean the exact logic that your conclusion is based on. You need to have the ability to extract this particular logic. We'll see that in this particular video. Now, if you have extracted the logic correctly, then you will see the magic that prethinking can do for you. So this is a classic example of a question where if you take some effort to understand the logic, and if you frame the correct question, you will arrive at the correct answers. There is no way you will not arrive at the correct answers. So we're going to see that in action as well. Thirdly, some of the answer choices here are very rich in terms of the learnings that you'll get from them. Some are complex, of course, but even the non-complex ones, even the not so popular ones, there are some interesting logical aspects that we can learn a lot from. All right, so extremely interesting video here. You will definitely learn something from this video. Let's go right here. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start by visualizing this particular argument. What do we know? There is a chain of islands. This particular chain of islands is called Marlandia, and recently a fossil has been discovered in this particular chain of islands, that is Marlandia. All right, so take a step back. Remember what a fossil is. A fossil is a piece of stone or a rock that contains the remains of some ancestral age-old species. That's what a fossil typically is. So it's usually bones, but you could also have other kind of remains. So let's call this particular species Y. The fossil contains the remains of some species. Let's call the species as Y. All right. The argument also tells us about a present day reptile that is indigenous to Marlandia. So in this particular island right now, there is this other species. Let's call the species X. Okay. X is an indigenous species. Indigenous means it's native to Marlandia. That doesn't mean that it does not exist anywhere else. By migration, it could exist in other places also, but it is native to Marlandia. Alright, so small nuggets of information that you're collecting so far. Now, here's the point. The most important point that's being communicated here is that, hey, this fossil proves that the present day reptile, let's say X, is actually a descendant of an ancient reptile species that lived on the island millions of years ago. Think about how this works as far as fossils are concerned. Looking at the fossil contains the remains of an ancestor Y. Somebody is able to conclude that it's proof that the modern day species X descended from an ancestor. In other words, the ancestor in question here is this very same ancestor. Fundamentally, what we are being told is that, hey, this particular fossil is proof that the modern day reptile X actually descended from the ancestor Y. Very important to understand this. Now, again, don't just read on. There are implications that you need to understand. When you say that X descended from Y, X is a descendant of Y, what is the logical inference there? What is the implication? It means that this species Y did not actually go extinct, right? Otherwise, if it went extinct, if it got wiped out, then you cannot claim descent. The fact that X is considered to be a descendant of Y means that Y did not get wiped out. It survived in some form. It eventually evolved to become X. The line could not have been broken. This particular species could not have been completely wiped out. Alright? It doesn't exist as Y today. That's because it has evolved over a period of time to become X. But the species did not get wiped out. That's an important inference that you draw from the understanding of what it means when you say X descended from Y. So far so good. Now let's move on. So we are given that this particular finding, that is this fossil that has been the discovery of this particular fossil, which proves that X descended from Y, it is surprising. Why is it surprising? Because this ancestral species, that is why, it was thought to have become extinct when Marlandia was submerged in a global sea level rise that happened 25 million years ago. Fundamentally, 25 million years ago, the sea level rose. Marlandia was believed to have been submerged at this point of time, and given that Marlandia was believed to have been submerged at that point of time, the belief was the species Y that used to exist here, it got wiped out, it became extinct. That was the earlier belief. Now you can see why the finding is actually surprising, because it tells us that hey, the species did not actually go extinct, it somehow survived. Eventually it evolved over a period of time to become X. So this particular fossil kind of refutes this earlier belief that Y went extinct at the time, at a point 25 million years ago, when the sea level actually rose. So far so good. Now let's move to the conclusion. Based on the new discovery, what is this new discovery? The fossil that has been discovered, the implication being that this ancestral species Y actually survived and did not get wiped out. Based on this discovery, scientists have concluded that hey, 25 years ago there was a sea level rise that happened. The sea level did rise, but not every inch of Marlandia was submerged. There was at least some portion of Marlandia that remained unsubmerged. This particular aspect is the claim that is being made. It's the scientist conclusion. Scientists are concluding based on everything that we have read that hey, the rise in sea level that happened 25 million years ago, it definitely happened, but it did not submerge every part of Marlandia. There's at least some portion that did not get submerged. So this is a scientist conclusion. What are we to do in this particular question? We need to strengthen the scientist conclusion. For all practical purposes, the scientist is the author. Alright? Now that we have visualized the argument, you might think that the job is done. Not really. Before you do any kind of pre-thinking, you need to specifically spend time visualizing the conclusion, understanding the conclusion exactly. You need to crystallize the exact logic which is the basis of this particular conclusion. So let's do that. In this case, the conclusion is fairly straightforward. We've understood it. The conclusion, as again I'll repeat this, 25 million years ago there was a rise in sea level that happened. Not all parts of Marlandia were submerged. There's at least some part of Marlandia that did not get submerged. That's the conclusion. Now, based on everything that you have read, this entire argument gives you a lot of information. You're talking about a modern day species that is X, you're talking about a fossil, you're talking about an ancestor that is Y. What is the actual logic which is the basis of this conclusion? It's very simple. It boils down to one simple fact, that the ancestor Y actually survived. Earlier the belief was when the sea level rose, Marlandia got submerged, and when Marlandia got submerged, Y became extinct, Y got wiped out. Now, with the knowledge that Y did not get wiped out, with the knowledge that Y continued to survive, the notion is that hey, how did this Y actually survive? It must have survived by staying afloat on some unsubmerged piece of land. That's why it survived, and that is why it's on the basis of this underlying logic that the author makes the claim that there must have been some kind of unsubmerged land at that point. Not every inch of Marlandia got submerged. So again, make sure the logic is clear. It's entirely based on the ancestor Y. It does not care about the modern day ancestor X, modern day reptile X. It does not care about any other species that exists. The logic is only based on the fact that the ancestor Y somehow survived the rise in sea level. The author believes, or the scientist here believes, that the reason Y survived the rise in sea level is because it managed to stay afloat on some kind of some unsubmerged piece of land. And if there was some unsubmerged piece of Marlandian land, that means that there must have been some piece of land that is unsubmerged. That's the conclusion. That's the logical basis behind the conclusion. All right. Now, this is what I mean when I say you're extracting the logic from all the information given in the argument. The logic behind the conclusion is just simply this point: the fact that Y survived the rise in sea level. Okay. So if this is clear, now let's do our pre-thinking. The key to doing a good pre-thinking is to understand the correct question to ask. So we are dealing with a strengthened question. We want to strengthen this particular conclusion. How do we strengthen a conclusion? One of the best ways of finding a strengthener is by finding assumptions. In other words, we employ the same approach that we use to solve assumption questions. We falsify the conclusion, we identify those scenarios where the conclusion breaks down, and then we guard against those breakdown scenarios by putting in assumption statements. Every assumption that you find is also by default a strengthener. So that's one way of arriving at beautiful strengtheners. All you have to do is identify those situations where your conclusion breaks down and then guard against those situations. You will arrive at strengtheners. That's what we're going to do now. So how do you break down this conclusion? What is the breakdown situation here? The scientists conclude that the rise in sea level that happened 25 million years ago, at least some part of Marlandia remained unsubmerged. So when can the scientists not conclude that the rise in sea level that happened 25 million years ago left at least a part of Marlandia unsubmerged, given that the ancestor Y survived through this rise in sea level that happened 25 million years ago? If you stop with this question and try to arrive at scenarios, you could, but this is where logic becomes extremely important. If you really think about it logically, this actually boils down to another question. How else could ancestor Y have survived the sea level? Essentially, your conclusion is that there was a piece of unsubmerged land when the sea level rose. If you have to arrive at a situation where there was no such piece of land, you need to be able to explain how the ancestors survived, even if the entire Marlandian land got submerged. Because then the author cannot look at this statistic, this piece of data that says Y survived, and then make the conclusion that there must have been some unsubmerged land. In essence, if you can find out some other reason for how the ancestor Y was able to survive the rise in sea level 25 million years ago, which is not related to them surviving on any unsubmerged land, that would be a valid conclusion breakdown situation. So the key question you have to ask is, let's assume that Marlandia got fully submerged. Not even an inch of Marlandia remained as land. It was entirely underwater. Assume that that happened. Now you know that Y survived. Your job is to find out how Y could have survived. What can explain how Y survived even though Marlandia got fully submerged? If you can find an answer to this question, every answer you find for this question is a conclusion breakdown scenario. By guarding against those scenarios, you will be fundamentally supporting the conclusion. Or in other words, you'll be arriving at strengtheners. So let's do precisely that. I could come up with three. There are actually more than three in the situation. I encourage you to find them as well. So what can explain how, essentially we're asking the question, how did Y survive the rise in sea level, assuming that the place got completely submerged 25 million years ago? One situation is about survival. Somehow Y was able to survive underwater or on water because the place got submerged. The other the other broad framework is about migration. Maybe it did not have the means to survive, but it migrated elsewhere and then came back. So let's discuss this. The first situation that we can think about is, somehow the creature had the adaptation necessary to survive, even on water. Okay, Marlandia got entirely submerged in water, but the ancestor Y could survive in water. Maybe the ancestor Y was like an amphibian, it was like a turtle. It could survive in water as well. If this is true, if the ancestor Y could survive in water as well and not just on land, then for all you know, the entire Marlandia got submerged. The reason why survived is because it could survive on water. It had nothing to do with the creature staying afloat on some unsubmerged piece of land, right? So obviously a situation like this will break your conclusion, because then the fact that Y survived, you cannot use it as proof to say that there was an unsubmerged piece of land. No, Y survived because it could survive even underwater. So the fact that Marlandia got submerged did not matter to it. It had already had the necessary adaptation to do it, to survive. So if you have if you want a strengthener here, you should guard against the situation. So essentially we have to say something which says this ancestor reptile, that is Y, it could not have survived in water or underwater. There's no way it could have survived when the island got submerged. This in fact is in line with the correct answer. The correct answer here is option E. This particular pre-thought idea is in line with this particular with option E. Alright, but this is not the only situation. Like I told you, this particular situation talks about how the species could have survived in Marlandia. Now there are situations where definitely the ancestor Y did not have the necessary adaptations to survive when the place got submerged, but maybe it migrated elsewhere and then came back. So one situation where that could happen is, what if the ancestor Y had wings? It was like a bird, it had wings. What if when the sea level started rising in Marlandia, when the supposed extinction event, that is the rise in sea level, happened, the ancestor simply flew away to some other landmass which was safe and then came back at a much later point when Marlandia re-emerged from the water. In this situation, the ancestor Y survived not because it stayed afloat on some unsubmerged piece of land. It survived because it migrated to another place by flying. It's as simple as that. So a strengthener has to guard against this situation. Essentially, it would be something which says that this particular reptile ancestor, that's why it did not have the option of flying away to a different land. It could not have flown away to a different land when the sea level rose and then come back later. The third strengthener that I could think about is also related to migration, but this is about migration by land. Look at this picture that I have for you. What if 25 million years ago, Marlandia was actually connected to another landmass like this? And what if during the sea level rise, Marlandia completely got submerged when the sea level rose, but as the sea level was rising, the species, that is why at least some members of the species, they migrated to this connected landmass, and later on when Marlandia re-emerged, the land re-emerged, at some point in time, at least some members of the species did a reverse migration. They came back to Marlandia and then they repopulated Marlandia. So essentially, this is migration by land. The species Y essentially avoided getting extinct, avoided getting wiped out by migrating by land to a connected landmass, and then they came back. Of course, in this situation, what this means is at some other point later in time, after this reverse migration, this land broke off, which is why Marlandia today is that completely unconnected set of islands, right? A situation like this will also break a conclusion, and therefore a strengthener here has to guard against this situation. It should say something like 25 million years ago when the sea level rose and when the entire Marlandia island got submerged, this ancestor reptile did not even have the option. It could not have migrated by land to a connected landmass and then come back again when it was safer. That option did not exist. Something on these lines is also a valid strengthener. So there you have it, three fantastic strengtheners. The one thing you should take away from this discussion is, again, notice how if you extract the correct logic, you understood that the logic is only dependent on ancestor Y. It's only about how did Y survive the increase in sea level. That's all. That one piece is the only relevant piece here. If you extracted that logic, if you frame the right question, notice how you're able to come up with so many proper strengtheners by pre-thinking. So that's why pre-thinking really works, guys. Now let's go to option choice analysis, or rather answer choice analysis. Each and every answer choice here has something to tell us. Okay, even the easy ones. So option A is not very popular. Most of you would not have chosen this, but still, let's discuss this. Option A says reptiles in Marlandia have developed to many environmental changes since the sea level rise. So fundamentally, 25 million years ago, there was this event that happened, which is the rise in sea level. So if you think about it, the rise in sea level is also an environmental change. So you had environmental change 0. I'm calling this EC0. This particular environmental change that happened was the rise in sea level. Now, what option A tells us is not about this particular environmental change, that is the rise in sea level. It is about environmental changes that happened after the rise in sea level. So environmental changes since the rise in sea level. So the sea level rose 25 million years ago. Some point later you had other environmental changes. For example, there could have been a rise in temperature in that particular area. There could have been an increase in forest cover, something. So many different possibilities are there. What option A tells us is the reptiles that are there in Marlandia right now, so this would include, X, which is the modern day descendant of Y. These reptiles, they have been able to adapt, they have adapted to many of these environmental changes that happened after the sea level rose. But think about it. Or in other words, a creature like X is actually adapted to the rise in temperature that happened after the sea level rose in Marlandia. Great. The problem is, it does not tell you anything about the ancestral species Y. It does not tell you whether Y survived this particular environmental change, that is the rise in sea level. And if it does not tell you anything about that, it does not have any real impact on this conclusion. Think about it. If option A meant that Y, the ancestral species Y, it was able to adapt, it was able to develop some adaptation to survive the environmental change, that is the rise in sea level, EC0. If this was true, then it would reduce your belief in the conclusion. Why? Because then the reason why survived is not because there was some unsubmerged piece of land. Maybe it developed an adaptation to survive underwater, right? So if we know that Y developed some adaptation to survive underwater, or to be able to survive the event that is the sea level rise, that would reduce your belief in the conclusion. If you are told that the particular species, that is Y, it could not have, or it did not adapt to this particular environmental change, that is the rise in sea level, that would increase your belief in the conclusion. If you know that the species could not have adapted to the rise in sea level, then the only reason it survived was probably because it managed to stay afloat on an unsubmerged piece of land. The problem with option A, it does not talk about ancestral species Y. More importantly, it talks about environmental changes that happened since the rise in sea level. It does not talk about whether adaptations were made to survive the rise in sea level itself, which makes option A irrelevant. Alright, now let's go to option B. Again, a very easy choice to eliminate if you really think through logically. If you chose this, I actually know why you chose this. We're going to discuss that. Option B says Marlandia separated from a much larger landmass about 80 million years ago. Now, let's take a small detour. Let's do this exercise. There are two events that are of interest here. Let's say event 1 is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka separated from the Indian subcontinent, let's say around 50,000 years ago. In reality, it's much earlier than that, but let's say 50,000 years ago. So Sri Lanka separated from India, from the Indian subcontinent 50,000 years ago. That's event 1. Event 2, at least some part of Sri Lanka got submerged when the sea level rose 20,000 years ago. So at a much later date, fundamentally. Here's a question for you. Does event 1 at any level increase your belief in event 2? Does the fact that Sri Lanka separated from the Indian subcontinent 50,000 years ago in any way make you believe more in the conclusion that, hey, at least some portion of Sri Lanka may not have got submerged or may have escaped getting submerged when the sea level rose 20,000 years ago? If you think about it, event 1 and event 2, there is no tangible connection between them. The fact that Sri Lanka separated from India tells you nothing about whether some part of Sri Lanka would have got submerged or whether some part of Sri Lanka would have not got submerged many years later. There is no tangible connection that you can make here. This is the simple problem with option B. Just a statement that tells us that, hey, 80 million years ago, much earlier, Marlandia broke off from a larger landmass. It tells us nothing about whether 25 million years ago some part of Marlandia stayed unsubmerged or did Marlandia entirely get submerged. This statement tells you nothing about the conclusion, which is why it's completely irrelevant. Now, if you chose this, there is a chance that you got confused because this is somewhat along the lines of our strengthener 3. By that I mean it uses the same idea of a connected landmass. So option B also talks about a landmass which was connected, but it was connected 80 million years ago. If you fell for this, then you're making the mistake of jumping to an answer choice because it matches your pre-thinking somewhat. The problem with option B is, even though it explores the same idea of connected landmass, it is not written in a way to be a strengthener. Let me explain why. So what happens here is 80 million years ago, let's talk about the situation 80 million years ago. So 18 million years ago, let's say Marlandia was connected to this particular large landmass. Let's call this A. What we know is 80 million years ago, Marlandia separated from A. So this was what happened. So this is the bigger landmass which got separated 80 million years ago. Just the fact that it separated from a larger landmass 80 million years ago does it necessarily mean that 25 million years ago Marlandia was not connected to some other large landmass? Not necessary, right? Or in other words, even if option B is true, the possibility of land migration still exists. Even in such a situation, there could have been some other large landmass that Marlandia is connected to 25 million years ago. So when the sea level rose 25 million years ago, submerging all of Marlandia, at this point the species Y could have migrated to this connected landmass 25 million years ago and then come back to Marlandia at a later time. This is definitely a possibility, right? What I'm trying to tell you is option B, the way it is written, it does not exclude the possibility of land migration. Or in other words, it is not a strengthener because it does not guard adequately against the possibility of land migration. Unlike the way we have written strengthener 3. If you see the difference is that the way we have written it, during the time of the rise in sea level, or in other words, when this rise in sea level actually happened, the reptile, that is why it could not have survived, it could not have done this land migration. We are excluding that possibility, and that's how we are guarding against that possibility of the land migration. On the other hand, option B, the way it is written, though it is kind of hinting at the same idea, that is land migration, it is not doing an adequate job of guarding against that possibility, and therefore it's not a valid strengthener. So if you fell for option B, this is another important aspect that you need to understand of why it's even though it conveys a similar idea, it's not written properly. So there's a very important lesson here. An answer choice can be related to your pre-thought idea, but it could still be worded in a way that makes it incorrect. Or in other words, don't rush through your answer choices. Even just because something is along the lines of what you thought, it still has to be written correctly. All right. So now let's move to option C. Option C is the most popular incorrect choice, and there is a good reason for it. It is almost the correct answer. The trap is very subtle. It's a very important lesson. The test maker is teaching you something very important to this question. All right. So option C says no fossils that prove the relationship between the present day species and the ancestral species have been found anywhere other than Marlandia. In other words, what this is trying to say is such fossils have not been found anywhere apart from Marlandia. So fundamentally, you have Marlandia. What this option is essentially trying to say is the fossil, essentially, if you remember your fossil is of the ancestral species Y. What option C is trying to tell you is 25 million years ago, when the sea level rose, Y existed only in Marlandia. Y did not exist in any of these any other piece of land anywhere else on the planet. That's what option C is trying to tell you, that no such fossils have been found anywhere other than Marlandia. Now, it's almost a strengthener. Why? If it is true that Y existed nowhere apart from Marlandia, if it is really true that Y existed only in Marlandia and nowhere else, then the fact that Y still survived despite the entire Ireland, despite Marlandia getting submerged when the sea level rose, it kind of increases your belief that when the sea level rose, at least some portion did not get submerged, so at least some portion remained unsubmerged, right? Because it also, this particular option also guards against the theory of migration. Fundamentally, if Y had served, if 25 million years ago, either by migration at this point or migration at an earlier point in time, if Y also existed on some other piece of land, let's say Y survived on this particular piece of land, then Marlandia could have gotten completely submerged, but the species lived on this particular landmass. Later on, when Marlandia re-emerged, this species, at least some members of the species, moved to Marlandia and repopulated Marlandia. So this possibility exists. This could also explain how Y survived, even though Marlandia got fully submerged. So what option C is trying to do is guard against this possibility. Now, the problem with option C is it only tells you that no such fossils have been found. That does not mean that no such fossils exist. In reality, if no such fossils have been found, there are two possibilities, and both these possibilities are equally probable. You cannot say that one is a more likely scenario. So if no such fossils have been found, it could be that no such fossils actually exist, or in other words, definitely this particular species, that is why, is only found in Marlandia, Or it could also mean that such fossils definitely exist, it's just that they have not been discovered yet. Remember, these are fossils, it takes time to discover them. So the problem is, just the fact that no fossils have been found does not tell you which of these scenarios is valid. If scenario 1 is the valid scenario, or in other words, if in reality no such fossils exist anywhere except Marlandia, then option C is actually a strengthener. But we don't know. In reality, the actual reason why no such fossils have been found could also be that it's not yet been discovered. They exist, but they have not been discovered. So both these scenarios are likely. Therefore, option C is not a conclusive strengthener because you don't know which scenario is actually applicable here. If option C is reworded in some way to communicate that it's not that no such fossils have been found, it is that no such fossils exist, then option C can also be considered to be a strengthener. So please be aware of the trap that is here. It's a very subtle trap that the test maker is throwing at us. If you understand this, it will actually save you in a lot of other questions as well. Alright, with that, let's move to option D. Option D is also somewhat popular, but it's fairly easy to eliminate if you understand the true logic. At this point, you know the true logic. You know that the only thing that matters to this conclusion is not any of the present day reptiles. Any of the present day reptiles, including the descendant X, they don't matter in this equation at all. The only reptile that is of relevance to this conclusion is Y, and which is what makes option D irrelevant. Why? Because option D talks about the present day reptiles. The present day reptiles, they are able to thrive on very tiny Marlandian islands. Or in other words, it's trying to say that if you take even the modern day descendant X, it could have survived on the tiniest patch of land. But the problem is it's talking about X, it's not talking about the ancestor Y. X may be in a position to survive on very tiny land. It doesn't tell you about whether Y could have survived on a very tiny stretch of land. You have no idea about that. Option D is simply irrelevant because it does not give you any information about the ancestor Y or how Y survived the particular event, that is the rise in sea level. So it's completely irrelevant. This brings us to the one correct option here, which is option E. And you can immediately see the magic of pre-thinking. You can see that this is exactly what you pre-thought. In fact, this is our pre-thinking one. Option E says the ancestral reptiles, or in other words, in this case for us it's ancestor Y, they could not have survived long at sea. Or in other words, it's eliminating the possibility of Y surviving by having, because it had the necessary adaptation to survive on water or underwater. Think about it. If the ancestor Y, it could have, if it cannot survive underwater or on water, it could not have survived at sea, then it increases our belief in that idea that had Marlandia been completely submerged, the species should have gone extinct, right? If the species could not have survived underwater or on water, then if Marlandia went completely extinct, if Marlandia got completely submerged, then typically your species should have gone extinct. That was the expectation. Now, given that Y did not actually go extinct, it increases your belief that hey, the species definitely cannot survive on water. Maybe it survived because there was some piece of land that remained unsubmerged. The species survived by staying afloat on this unsubmerged piece of land. So this is along the lines of our pre-thought strengthener 1. It is the only correct answer to this question. So what are the learnings from this question? Quite a few. First and foremost, do not just try to understand just the meaning conveyed by the sentences in the argument. Before you go to answer choice analysis and before you go to pre-thinking, specifically spend a few seconds in trying to crystallize the exact logic used to arrive at the conclusion. This logic is sometimes a very specific thing that you extract from the rest of the passage, from the argument itself. This step is important. It will save you in complex questions. All right. The second learning is, hey, once you've extracted the logic, try to arrive at the correct question. The key to solving CR questions is to identify what question should you ask to get the correct answer. So your entire pre-thinking approach is built on identifying that correct question. If you find the right question, you will arrive at not just one, several possible right answers. Your pre-thinking gets much sharper, your answer choice analysis is also much sharper and more precise. Alright? Third, analyze the option choices deeply. Do not rush. Even an option choice like A, you might have rejected it for a very simple reason, but look at the level of depth that is actually there in some of these options. There are logical implications. You need to be very careful in your analysis. And once you practice questions like this, you really get good at doing this under time constraints. Now, there are also some specific lessons that we learned from this argument, from this particular question. The lesson from option B is that, hey, an answer choice can be related to our own pre-thought idea, but it can still be worded in a manner that makes it incorrect. You saw that option B is actually along the lines, it's written on the same concept, that is the concept of land migration to a connected landmass, but the way it is written, it is still incorrect. Very important learning. Don't rush with regard to options just because it seems to match your pre-thinking. Don't blindly choose the option. Very important lesson there. Lesson from option C: just because no evidence of something has been found so far, it does not mean that no such evidence exists. It could also mean that the evidence exists, it just hasn't been found yet. So there is a difference between evidence being found and evidence actually existing. Be aware of this distinction. You might have other questions in future that also tests you on this aspect. All right, so those are the broad learnings that I get from this question. As always, if you like what you saw, do consider liking this video. If you want us to do more content of this sort, solve such difficult questions, or at least seemingly difficult questions, do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. And with that, as we always say, happy learning.